Introduction to Bradford, Winthrop, and the Puritans, Part 2, Puritan Beliefs and Concepts. I want to take a few minutes to explain some ideas associated with the Puritans and to define some terms. Grace is God's favor, or how he bestows blessings on his people. Providence is God's protection or spiritual care. The Puritans believed in a covenant of grace between Christ and those who believe in him. This replaced the covenant of works between God and Adam that was broken by Adam's fall. From this comes a sense of predestination or election, the belief that God has chosen or elected those who will be saved. This wasn't something to fear, as the Puritans believed that they were part of the elect, or those chosen by God to be saved. Indeed, the Puritans believed in outward signs of grace. You would know if you were in God's graces and thus saved, depending on how your life was going. If your life is going fine, you and your family are prosperous, this is God's doing and a sign that you are doing good and leading a virtuous life. However, if you are struggling or fall on hard times, then you must have done something wrong, and God is providing you trials to let you know you have erred so you can find your way back to God and be back in his graces. One of the things we see in Rowlandson's captivity narrative and in Bradstreet's letter to her children is how God creates adversity to test one's faith and set one back on the right path. This happens through a process of self-examination. When faced with adversity, people must examine their lives to find where they have erred, where they have strayed from God's grace, so they can atone for their sins and find their way back into his favor. As outward signs of grace were important to the Puritans, they viewed God as having a hand in their lives, and God's influence was reflected in all that happened to them. Essentially, they believed God was meddling in their day-to-day affairs, and signs of miracles were ever present. Writers like Bradford refer to signs of God's grace or God's providence all throughout their works. Indeed, we can see this in two particular related passages. First, in the beginning of chapter 9, Bradford tells of a special work of God's providence. One of the sailors had been making fun of the pilgrims and how they were seasick, boasting that he would see half of them cast overboard, essentially what was done when somebody died at sea. However, it pleased God before they came half seas over to smite this young man with a grievous disease, of which he died in a desperate manner, and so was himself the first that was thrown overboard. And Bradford notes it was the just hand of God upon him. This contrasts with the story of John Howland, one of their own, who during a storm was tossed overboard. But it pleased God that he caught hold of the topsail halyards, which hung overboard, and ran out at length. And holding onto these ropes, he was pulled back aboard the ship and was saved. In this, we see how God protects those that he favors and smites those that he does not. And we see throughout chapters 9 and 10, with the landing in America, the early encounters with Native Americans, finding stores of food and seed, how the providence of God is in all of these situations. What we think of as the Puritan work ethic, the idea of working hard to get ahead in life, which becomes the basis of the American dream in the Enlightenment era. This is related to the belief of outward signs of grace. If you want to show others that you're in God's graces and one of the elect, then you need to be prosperous. Thus, working hard to achieve prosperity is important to prove you are in God's graces. If you slack off and fall on hard times, this would be a sign that you had fallen out of God's favor. The Puritans also practiced typology, the belief that what happened in their lives and their relationship with God were reflected in the Bible, particularly Old Testament stories, which is why we see biblical references all throughout works like Bradford's and Rowlandson's. They particularly compare themselves as a chosen people to the Israelites, who had been given the promise of a new land. For example, on page 77, there's a reference to Deuteronomy and Pisgah, the mountain from which Moses saw the promised land. Indeed, both the Pilgrims and the larger group of Puritans who settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony headed by John Winthrop saw their venture to America as coming to the new promised land or the new Canaan, and they were setting up a city of God, or in Winthrop's terms, a city upon a hill for all to see and bear witness to, whether its success or its failure. Bradford, therefore, is not just writing a history or telling what occurred. He is creating a legend or a myth of this colony's beginnings in the New World, one based on their religious beliefs. In doing so, he creates suspense and a sense of triumph as they struggle against adversity and against Satan. Like the Israelites wandering the desert, they crossed the treacherous ocean to find the promised land. And with hard work, perseverance, and God on their side, they would succeed. As Bradford writes at the end of chapter 9, noting how they were all alone in this new world and referencing Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 6 to 8, what could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? May not and ought not the children of these fathers rightly say, "Our fathers were Englishmen, which came over this great ocean, and were ready to perish in this wilderness? But they cried unto the Lord, and He heard their voice, and looked on their adversity." The stuff of which legends are born.